Okay, Saliem, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Saliem Haider. I'm the Circular Economy Program Manager at Green Cape, and I've joined them from February of this year. And prior to that, my experience has really been as the solid waste manager, both at the City of Cape Town in the municipality, as well as Stellenbosch municipality. So very much a waste focus and a waste disposal focus for most of my life. But yeah, I think the opportunity now is to look at things a little bit differently in terms of circular vision and ensuring that we get a lot more out of what is deemed waste materials that could otherwise be beneficiated. So that in essence is what my role would be. Within the circular economy desk of Green Cape, there are two sort of sector desks. The one looks at waste, and that's really getting a lot of data and information around the sort of waste sectors. And here we're talking about organic waste, textile waste, we're talking about paper waste, cardboard, etc. Hazardous waste, anything that sort of leads to waste that we need to look at in terms of what could we really do to beneficiate the product. It's not really so much from an environmental perspective, but it's more on an economic perspective to look at how we could actually inject some economic drivers within it, get investment opportunities and job creation as well. So that really is the big focus around the topic. And the second sort of desk is what's known as the Western Cape Industrial Symbiosis Program, which is really interesting because here we're looking at, particularly among manufacturers, to see what is one manufacturer's waste stream that could actually become another's input. Reason for that being to look at really major or bulk waste items instead of sending it off to landfill and putting additional pressures on sort of very limited landfill airspace that we've got, is to actually beneficiate it from company to company, and in so doing get a lot of gains as such. So that's known as WISP.
Yeah, that's great. And then won't you, Saliem, just in terms of Cape Town, I think it's really interesting because Cape Town has a very long, I don't know if you know this, Christina, has a very long and rich history of textile, as a textile industry location. Obviously, that's been decimated by various kind of policy decisions and the global market, the opening of the global market. But Saliem, over to you just in terms of giving that Cape Town context. It's very interesting.
Yes, thank you. I think in terms of the manufacturing sector, we have been decimated, and it's resulted in a lot of cheap imports coming in. And I think price became the determinable factor over quality and other sort of environmental sort of factors as well, resulting in more and more waste actually now being landfilled or being brought about as waste products, which is unfortunate. And I think Cape Town in itself has actually got a very sort of large let's call it a base of seamstresses, tailors, etc., very skilled artisans that could actually be much better beneficiated and utilized in terms of the actual industry itself. And if that could be re-stimulated, that would be fantastic. I've got one anecdote of just during the COVID crisis, we've had quite a lot of soup kitchens sort of opening up in very impoverished areas. But it's very difficult for them to sustain themselves over long periods of time. And the demand is actually great out there. In fact, it is so hard for any sort of kitchen to run out of stocks or not to be able to feed another hungry person that's there. And in terms of trying to look at a sustainability model, they thought, let's pull in all these sort of unemployed seamstresses that we've got in this area. And the area I'm referring to is actually the area called Delft, which is high unemployment, lots of social issues within the region. And they have been able to actually put together and decided to make these sort of face masks for the people. And they've now received an order of, you wouldn't believe it, 1 million face masks that need to be made. So that's a 3 million rand injection into the sort of industry. And that is to sustain these sort of food kitchens that's there. So there's a big role that could be played. And it's quite important to actually utilize these opportunities when we only see despair that's actually in front of us. But yeah, that's just one sort of example of how this could be better utilized. I've got another one which I'll keep for later.
Just one question before I go on. Is that using waste fabric though, Saliem, for those masks?
It's a mixture. Some of them are actual pure material, others are mainly offcuts. So we're talking about pre-consumer fabric waste as such.
Fantastic. Should we go over to Christina next?
Yeah, sure.
Christina, would you just give us a brief introduction of what you do and your background and where you're going?
Sure. Well, my name's Christina, and I am obsessed, I think, with waste. Waste infuriates me so much. And I've been living in the trenches of textile waste and fashion waste for about 14 years in APAC. And I am an angry activist who pretends to be an inside fashion person, which means that I sort of couple this deep environmental and social concern about waste with a very pragmatic and determined view of how do we actually get it back into fashion. So I've never introduced myself like that before, but I think I bridge the world of activism with the world of getting things done and being realistic about how we can solve these problems. And because I've been living in APAC, Asia, sort of Hong Kong, China for 12 years, I've seen it so real. I've heard it. I've been in waste issues for so long. So really what I actually do, that's my heart. What I actually do is I founded a non-profit called Redress, which is working to reduce waste in the fashion industry, really through educating and empowering the supply chain to create less waste and to benefit from waste. And then more recently, I started an upcycled fashion brand and waste management business, also to really, I think if I could summarize myself, and it's quite difficult to ever get that right, but essentially I hate waste and I chase solutions. And so I've worked non-profit and for-profit, lots of brand collaborations, working with suppliers, with designers, with businesses, with R&D, with charities, with logistics, literally the entire fashion world, to try to look at how can we get this circular economy going. We know that we have to, and it's no excuse to say it's difficult. We have to do it. Yeah, so that's me.
And Christina, from my perspective as a journalist and a writer, I think you're also incredibly good. Your organization is incredibly good at conveying information and doing it in an incredibly user-friendly way. And I think that's really a very important part of being an activist and a solution seeker as well. I mean, well done on that. I think it's amazing. So, to you, also based in Cape Town.
Hi Jackie, hi Saliem and Christina. My name is Esethu, as Jackie said. I'm from Cape Town, and we run a small textile recycling company which we founded about 2 years ago. And very similar to what Christina said, we are passionate about diverting the fashion industry's waste from landfill and finding different solutions for it to extend the life cycle of those textiles. So whether that be finding recyclers, finding downcyclers, finding upcyclers, finding different ways that this textile waste can be diverted and essentially, extend the life cycle of those garments. And this really started from a big passion in development, just in general. So, we started, I've always been into fashion, and all of the co-founders in the industry, in the company, have always been passionate about fashion as well. But we also have a social justice side of us that cares about equality, that cares about development, that cares about all of these things. And so being a fashion consumer, but being a young millennial who cares about social justice issues, at some point there was a bit of a conflict there when I realized what's actually going on in the industry. So we decided, cool, we don't want to participate in business as usual, but also we need to be realistic with the fact that we are in a developing country context. And so what does us caring about sustainable fashion actually mean in Africa, in South Africa, in a context where there's high unemployment, high inequality and poverty? How can sustainable fashion help? Because a lot of the times we think that sustainable fashion is something that can help in developed economies because the garments are more expensive. And so we really needed to find a way that we could bring the narrative of sustainable fashion, ethical fashion in South Africa. And that's where textile recycling came from. It's a labor-intensive process. We find that there's a lot of opportunity there for job creation. But also, when we look at the clothing value chain, a lot of the negative impacts happen in the developing countries. So in a lot of ways, when it comes to workers and when it comes to environmental concerns. And so in a lot of ways, ethical fashion in the developing country perspective is a good way to kind of deal with those issues, which will invariably also lead to improvements in equality, employment, and so forth. So we're passionate about development, we're passionate about ethical fashion, but we need to be realistic. We're in South Africa. How do we bring this narrative in South Africa and it actually helps our people?
I just had to say that was beautiful.
Thank you, Christina.
Yes, behind you. No, that was just such. I have a little tear in my eye. That was eloquent, to the point, in context. I mean, that was beautiful, and that's the beauty of what we're all striving to do. And that was so wonderfully put. Thank you so much.
So much.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to start with you, Esethu, to describe and explain the difference between mechanical recycling and chemical recycling, and what it is that you do and why you decided to go there.
Sure. So in the textile recycling space, like you mentioned, there's mechanical recycling, which is essentially when you are tearing the fabric. You're physically shredding and tearing the fabric in order for you to create that fiber. So then once you have it in fiber form, then you're able to respin it, and then you're able to produce your end product. So the characteristic there is the physical shredding and tearing apart of the fabric. Chemical recycling, on the other hand, is you don't do any physical tearing of the fabric. There's a chemical solvent. So they'll go into a lab, they'll put all sorts of, smart, crazy liquids in there, but there's essentially a chemical solvent, and you put the fabric in there and it chemically dissolves the components or the molecules of the fabric type. So your celluloses then will come out, and your PET will come out without any physical tearing. You just put it in the solvent, and then those elements come out, and then from there you're able to then respin and create your end product. So that is a short difference between the two. A lot of the current startups, particularly in the US and the EU, that are focusing on the problem of textile waste are focusing on chemical recycling. And so when we started researching, we know we want to solve this problem, but how do we solve it in the context of South Africa? We realized that the chemical recycling process that was used in the US and in the EU would not necessarily be applicable for a developing country context. You can imagine high technological costs will be involved there, R&D would be involved there, but also it's very energy efficient process. And if you're from South Africa, we have a lot of problems with Eskom right now. We have load shedding, and so to invest in a process that is extremely energy intensive is not necessarily the best process to use in a developing country context. And I also will say that I think that chemical recycling is kind of the next step, I think, in the textile recycling space, but there are still limitations currently in terms of its scalability. And I think a lot of the efforts that are currently being done, which are amazing efforts, phenomenal efforts, they're still in the lab kind of pilot phase, because we're still not sure as to the yields of end products that can come out from the textile waste being recycled in that process. So that's when then we started looking at mechanical recycling. And mechanical recycling, there's evidence of it in India, a developing country, in China, a developing country, and as well as Turkey. So when we looked at it into a bit more, the mechanical recycling process it's very easy to integrate it with the current infrastructure of the textile recycling industry. So the only thing in terms of capital that would need to be invested in is the beginning part of the process, which is the shredding and getting into fiber. And then from there, you can spin it with the already existing equipment that is in the industry. So having looked at Turkey, having looked at India, and also just learning lessons from India, that it's the recycling costs using mechanical recycling is a lot cheaper than using chemical recycling. So these are all the reasons that we had to take into account in terms of what's the best thing for us to replicate in South Africa, a developing country context, taking costs into account, and labor into account, and that's another very important thing is the labor aspect and employment. Mechanical recycling relies on labor, especially at the beginning part, and that's an opportunity, whereas in the US and the EU economy, they would kind of move towards more chemical recycling because there isn't maybe that need. So those are just some of the things we considered in terms of how did we want to recycle in South Africa.
So, Christina, I just want you to respond to what you do, and then Saliem, I want to ask you. But Christina, what is the experience in your experience from the East? What what is the most commonly used process?
Yeah, I think you've summarized it really well in terms of the pros and cons and the parameters for cost and supply. So I would pretty much second what you've just said. APAC area has a lot of emerging markets and therefore also developing economies with some similar constraints in terms of, energy supply, etc. I think what I would add, and it's a statement and a question, is perhaps one of the benefits that the APAC area has on South Africa, and maybe you'll disagree with me, is that we in APAC are a higher textile exporting area. So there's a great demand for raw material. By raw material, I'm talking about recycled yarns, whether it's coming from a mechanical process or from a chemical process. Because, obviously we all know historically APAC, China is, the manufacturing hotspots of the world. So we have the benefit of a greater demand, I believe, than South Africa. But that's really a question back to you, because you could put a lot of money into, setting up a mechanical recycling factory is not cheap either. And it does, of course, require energy. And obviously setting up a chemical recycling factory is much greater. And it has a lot of risks around chemical management as well. But my question is really that the only way that recycling works is if we have a demand for the new recycled material. And so, we've spoken about the craft and this circular economy and the job creation, but what is the demand for recycled yarns in South Africa? And if it's not enough domestically, are you set up for export?
That's a good question.
Well, maybe Saliem, you can respond to that.
Yeah, and I'd like to also.
And also, yeah.
Yeah, I think when it comes to recycling, it's really demand driven. That's one of the key things. In fact, we've actually found from the pre-consumer waste side of it that there's actually 3 companies that's been established over the past 4 years. Prior to that, there hadn't been any around to actually take care of textile waste material as such. And these 3 companies in total can basically handle 1,500 tons per annum as capacity. The actual loads coming through is around about 960 tons per annum. So there's actually capacity to take on more if it could just be channeled in that direction. But the other thing that would obviously play a big role is the demand for this material. And I think that's quite important. An interesting statistic I've also come across is that 70% of the world actually wears second-hand clothing. And I'm not sure what the sort of demand on second-hand clothing is, because if one actually look at that direction, that's a step better than recycling, because you cut out all the processes, and it's actually within the circular loop, whereas recycling is actually on the external side of the circular loop. So I think these are sort of some of the things that would need to be considered. Maybe a question from my side, based on the previous discussion, is that textiles can generally be split into 2. You've got natural textiles and you've got the synthetic textiles. In terms of the mechanical and chemical sort of treatment processes, which one favors which if we look at just the natural versus the synthetic fibers? Does that play a role?
Can I just jump in? Esethu, do you want to just jump in and respond to the earlier one? Because I want to just ask Christina a couple of things in response to Saliem.
Sure, on demand.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Very important question. And I think that, as a startup, that's one of the biggest things that our investors ask is, sure, there might be supply of textile waste in South Africa, but as an investor, where is the demand of the end product? And so the way we've decided to look at it as Rewoven is that if we're being completely honest and realistic, at the current state of the industry, a lot of the demand for recycled fibers for ethically made garments is in the US and EU economy and kind of the more developed economies. We don't have that demand in South Africa currently because a lot of the people in South Africa live below the poverty line. So they don't really have that demand for these products. A lot of the time they're quite expensive. So how we looked at it as Rewoven was, okay, we could look at it as a challenge or we could look at it as an opportunity, right? One thing that I know is that South Africa has trade agreements and preferential trade agreements with countries like the US, countries like various countries in the EU, which have been set up for smaller textile producing countries to kind of leapfrog their way into development. So a lot of the sub-Saharan African clothing industry has actually been able to develop off of the back of preferential schemes such as AGOA, for instance. So your Kenya, your Lesotho, your Swaziland, your Tanzania, all of those countries, Ethiopia, have been able in the last 20 years to grow off of the back of these preferential trade agreements. So we thought, okay, cool. The demand currently is in your developed economies. We have an access into those markets in South Africa and these African countries that are now smaller textile producing countries. That is a trade opportunity. And as a development economist, one of the biggest things that we know is that the clothing industry is important because it diversifies our export base. And that is one of the big things that I know as South Africa we need. So we saw that as a trade opportunity. You know, we're based in South Africa. We recycle. In that process, we create jobs. We create this end product that has a demand, yes, not in South Africa currently, but in markets where we have an avenue into those markets. And then we're able to develop off of the back of that initially. But also, as time goes on, we are confident, well, maybe confident is a strong word, but we do foresee that the industry will change. As I always think about it in the 1970s when technology came in and a computer was as big as this room, and the cost of technology was so expensive, it was very exclusive, and to even be manufacturing that was, you know, it was only for certain companies that had capital. But now in 2020, everyone has this technology in their pockets. A TV that was the size of a whole room, you have it in your pocket. And I think that in the textile recycling space, we're very much in a similar phase as when the ICT age started in the 1970s, in that sustainable technologies are quite expensive now, but over time, as investment channels into those industries, the price of the sustainable technologies will go down, and therefore we'll be able to, just like we have now a cell phone, and everyone in the world has a cell phone, even people in developing countries, we foresee that as the cost of sustainable technologies come down, we'll be able to also supply the fabric, not only in developed economies, but the cost of it will be competitive for us to be able to produce in South Africa. And another thing that we learned from India, which is why we realized that this is something we could replicate in South Africa, is that because, and this is one of the manufacturers that I spoke to, is that because the price of cut fabric or textile waste is obviously less than the price of cotton per kg, they find that they were able to produce yarn that is made from recycled textiles that is cheaper than yarn made from virgin cotton. So, and this is a full-scale plant. So this tells us that at economies of scale, with certain, things in the market, that we are able to produce sustainable fabrics at a cost-competitive price, which means that demand question in South Africa, maybe people aren't interested in buying ethical clothing or sustainable fabric because it's sustainable. But if we were able to reach that price point, which is the most important thing in a developing country, then we'll be able to get that demand. So it is true to say that we have a long way to go when it comes to creating demand for these end products, and I think it comes with a lot of awareness. The more people know about it, the more that the demand will be there. But there are opportunities, I think, as developing countries, for us to use the growth of the ethical fashion market as an opportunity for us to tap into that for our own demand.
Which I think, Christina, is what I wanted to actually ask you, is a lot of what you do is developing a demand and an understanding and an awareness around sustainability and what sustainable fashion looks like, and the upcycling and the refashioning of clothes. So just to ask you a little bit about your experience of doing that, and then secondly to respond to Salim's comment about wearing secondhand clothes. That stat is quite high. I've never heard that before, Salim. It's amazing. But that also requires us to really look at quality of clothing, because fast fashion falls apart quite quickly. So the secondhand life cycle of a lot of the clothes that are being made currently can't do that. So just, Christina, your comments on that. I think those are two very very important points that you have experience in.
Yeah, okay, I've got so many things to say. Let me get them out in a systematic way. So yes, we know, I believe, and I'm not going to contradict your statistics, Saliem, but I think that 70% of Africa wears secondhand clothes because of the obvious fact that the whole world, including China and obviously Europe, UK and the US, and I'm going to use the word dump their post-consumer clothing on African countries. Okay, I'm going to use that word because I think it's a negative word, and I think we need to kind of own that. So I believe it's 70% of Africa, but maybe it's the rest of the world as well. So yes, and to your point, of course, we're seeing a decrease in quality of clothing, which shortens that next reuse end of life perspective. And another complication that we've got is, and this answers another question of yours, Saliem, is about the composition of our clothes. We've seen over the last 10-ish years the blending of fibers, and this talks to the world of synthetics v natural. And so particularly in the fast fashion market, we've seen cotton and polyester being blended because polyester is cheaper than cotton. And so what we have is a big soup of mess of mixed fibers, which is very difficult to separate. And if we do want to separate mixed fibers, we have to use chemical recycling. So, I mean, I'm broadly trying to answer a few questions in one. And then I want to come to another point, which it's an infrastructure question, and it sort of ties in. Okay, I'm going to try and summarize. If we imagine that South Africa's got a lot of, or Africa's got a lot of imports of clothing waste from the rest of the world, and you've got your own clothing waste now coming in from your own consumers and your own, public. I want to know, and it would help me answer questions, is like, what is your sorting infrastructure? Because if we're talking about post-consumer clothes and rescuing fibers, you have to have an infrastructure to collect them. So, I mean, obviously once clothes hit landfill, that's their death. I believe you're not going to send sorters in. So that's my question on infrastructure for collection. And also, forgive me I've got one more question, because I'm obsessed with landfills. I want to know if you know, Saliem, and I'm putting you on the spot now, is the percentage of solid municipal waste that is clothing / textile. That's Reese's.
We've got good research on that. So Saliem, do you want to respond to that immediate question? Do you have more to say, Christina, before Saliem can respond to that? Because I think that's a very, and they've got research on that.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. That figure is roughly between 5-8% of the actual municipal solid waste that goes to landfill. There are actually sort of more other pressing sort of needs other than textiles that needs to be withdrawn from the municipal solid waste, particularly with new legislation that we are facing, particularly in the Western Cape region, and organics is one of them. Where there's going to be a total ban of organics to landfill by the year 2027, which may sound to be still 7 years off, but to put the infrastructure in place to actually ensure that not even one banana peel ends up in your black bag is going to be a daunting and expensive task for municipalities and for the householders to consider. Having said that, there's still a fair amount of textiles that's actually ending up in landfills unnecessarily, and hence it's that cycle that would need to be broken, but we need to do it in such a way that it doesn't lead to sort of further problems. Now we've seen, and there's been quite a lot about sort of synthetic materials that's been put on the market, for example, and some have actually demonstrated this sort of HDPE bottle that could actually be spun, stripped, and converted into toweling yarn type of material. But every time you put that through a washing cycle, you're going to start putting through nanoplastics back into the watercourses. So that in itself is not a great thing because you're causing other sort of problems down the line. So it's really finding that balance between working with natural, actual strong fibers that can last quite a while. And if you take a cotton shirt, for example, we've been told it's somewhere around 2,700 liters of water that's needed to make one cotton shirt, which we don't have, not in our sort of water scarce sort of environment. So the issue really is to find that balance between sustainability, cost effectiveness, and being able to survive. I think that's really the important issue.
So can I just ask Christina? Yeah, Christina, just in terms of an ideal kind of from manufacturing, basically from farm to, let's say from farm to fashion, what would be the best textiles to use and the best yarns to use to create a closed loop for the fashion? in terms of, so that what, like Salim's point about the yarns we're using, the best for recycling. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if we could go back to the drawing board, we would all be only using mono-fibres. It's very simple. And I'm not one of these fashion bashers that bashes polyester and synthetics, because I think synthetics still have a place to play. If you want to go to the gym, if you want to go skiing, if you want to go to the top of a mountain, if you want to get cold, you need to have synthetics. We need, like, your bra. Okay, ladies, do you want your boobs hanging out? I mean, I think we need some synthetics. So I say that in jest, but actually I mean it. I believe there is a place for synthetics, even though we have microfiber release and even though they come from oil, etc. So in answer to your question, we need to strip out and have monofibers only, and not to blend them, which is not always possible, because, you know, you also look at a woman who wants to wear tight jeans ain't going to get it from cotton.
Yeah.
So then, you know, you have to trade off, because women and men want to look good. It's not all, you know, most denim for women has some synthetics in it to give them the stretch. So this is why I say I'm not a fashion basher, because we strive for monofibers, but I believe we have to be realistic on functionality as well. And that is my only answer that I could give you.
But that does also, you know, the question of what trends are and what looks good and what, you know, versus what feels good and what's good for the planet and for the people. So I think that's a role that, I mean, you play in some parts of your role as an activist, and also the role of the media and the trend drivers. I think a very important part to play in this, and will increasingly have an important part to play.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing on that, actually, because, you know, we talk about certifications, and, you know, why are there not? What should I look for? And all these questions, which are very difficult to answer. And I find more recently that if I were giving advice to a consumer, it would be, yes, you might find, sorry,
Can you just
did I freeze?
You froze. Don't mind repeating the first question, just because you froze.
Sure. I'll try and pull it out again. You know, many consumers want to know, what should I buy and what should I look for? And over the years that I've been in the sector, we've seen standards come and go and certifications come and go. And certifying anything in the fashion supply chain is very difficult because it's so fragmented. So more recently, I find myself speaking about or advising consumers who are worried about this to go to the content label. Literally go and have a look at what the fibers are. Because if you really want to be into sustainable fashion, you have to understand fibers. Go to the content label and try to find monofibers. I mean, really, if you do that, you're doing your bit to try to separate these two material flows. So it's a very simple piece of advice. Try to buy monofibers if you can. Yeah.
Can I please respond to a question that Christina had, which I think is an important question on the sorting infrastructure in South Africa and what that looks like. And I think that, you know, us starting out 2 years ago in the collection phase of the textile recycling value chain, is that there's absolutely no sorting infrastructure. The value chain in South Africa still needs a lot of development. The stakeholders are all very much fragmented, which affects the efficiency to which we at this point can recycle fabrics. And the reason the sorting and even just the collection part of the value chain is very important in recycling is that it also can determine the quality of the end product. So if we're able to efficiently collect, if we're able to efficiently sort, because in the sorting process, you're sorting the different fibers, but you're also ensuring that the fibers are clean, you're ensuring that they're in the best condition to be recycled for the quality of the end product to be the best that you can get. But currently in South Africa, Christine, very few stakeholders. A lot of the guys currently in the textile recycling space are textile waste processors. So there isn't any kind of a collection except for us, we just started, but a company that is solely focusing on collection and assisting the throughput to these textile waste processes, which is why even though there's about a few textile waste processes in South Africa, some of them have been here for about 20, 30 years, not a lot of people know about them because that sorting, collection, that very first step in the textile recycling process, there's no infrastructure. It still needs to be developed. And so that is affecting the growth and the development of the textile recycling industry.
Salim, what is your experience of that? Because you were saying there are 3 recycling companies. Is that in the Western Cape or is that in South Africa?
That's in the Western Cape. And as I've mentioned before, a few years ago, there were none. So it's obviously growing. And I think people are seeing the sort of niche market that's there and the opportunities that's really there. But we really need to step it up on a bigger scale. But all of that's going to be dependent on the demand. And if the demand's not going to be there, as I mentioned, there's about plus minus 50 to 60 sort of textile companies still operating in the Western Cape, and they generate roughly 68 tons per annum of waste materials. These 3 companies can't take much more than that. So yeah, really one would need to get to the point where, you sort of break even, you sort of would be able to handle it, stimulate the demand on it. And if we can achieve that, then that would be great. But yeah, it all depends. What does the consumerism say? How's the fashion sort of fundies branding these sort of new products? So there's a lot of marketing, etc., that probably needs to be accompanied by it. But yeah, and cost, of course, is the other issue. If we could get that sort of at an acceptable scale or rate that becomes affordable, that would be great. I mean, I was just walking past quite a number of departmental stores sort of during the sort of stage 5-4 lockdown sort of period. Clothing was sort of marked down to 20% of its price. Yet there was no one buying it because everybody was at the food counters and food stores. So the essentials really came to light. So yeah, it's really about the needs, the wants, the necessity. And I think with the whole COVID issue, I think everybody has been put on reset, and it would be interesting to see what the new drive would be from there. However, having just gone through the same stores through stage 1 lockdown, you could see the prices going back to where it had been previously. So I'm not sure if there's a demand. I don't have the sort of retail figures from these stores, but it would be interesting to note whether people are buying clothes again and putting that as a priority over their previous needs that had been there. So we're actually in interesting times, and it would be it'd be great to actually see where all of this is sort of panning out, because we need to create those sort of investment opportunities so that we can actually improve the economy that's there in this market.
I have a question for Celine, something that just came into mind. So obviously a lot of the work that Green Cape is doing is focusing on the waste economy and kind of finding economic incentives to facilitate the growth of this circular economy. But I think I'm interested in understanding the role of government and policy that they have to play in this, because a lot of your focus is industry, the economy, the incentives, the business models, etc. But in a lot of the work that we're doing, we're realizing, for instance, a policy decision that has to do with landfill rates is something that's very important, that will then incentivize whether people want to dispose with a recycler or they want to dispose at landfill. And for instance, the difference between how KwaZulu-Natal's landfill rates are pretty stable and pretty cheap, and so a lot of the textile waste would be going to landfill, whereas in the Western Cape we see that landfill rates are going up, and maybe that would be an opportunity to incentivize people to recycle versus to use landfill. So I'm interested in the role that government and policy has to play in the development of this role, and what are your thoughts on that?
Government is actually pushing very big now on the extended producer responsibility, and there's been a lot of drafts that's been going around now, and I know that our minister is actually very much pushing for as much diversion from landfill as possible. So they're actually making the producers and manufacturers responsible for ensuring that there's some sort of incentive, some sort of mechanism in place within which to actually divert waste unnecessarily from landfill sites. So that's one of the sort of key and big sort of drivers that's coming into play. Of course, there are other sort of incentivized schemes as well. We're talking about textiles, and this is really around the fashion industry, but one of the other sort of key areas that government is seriously looking at is actual personal protective clothing, which is not necessarily part of the fashion industry, but where there's a real need and demand because government is a huge uptaker of personal protective equipment. And again, this is sort of imported, mainly from China. The quality is always suspect. They don't do what they intended to do. So we're looking at sort of health and safety risks that's associated with that as well. And again, that whole drive is there because within South Africa, we've also got what's known as the Extended Public Works Program, the EPWP program, which government is sort of driving to ensure there's a lot of job creation exercise there, albeit short term, but every time you employ, and that's normally from a 3 to a 6 month period that the project runs, and then you've got to bring in the next lot of people to come in to try and ensure that as many people get job opportunities as possible. What often happens is that you've not just handed out PPE to that person and that needs to be taken in. Where does that end up with? In the landfill. So I see that as a bit of a lost opportunity. If that material could actually be recycled and put back through the loop and put up infrastructure for it, you could actually get this thing going through. You'd be creating the sort of opportunities from within, and you'd have much less unnecessarily going to landfill because a product, I'm sure, is still good after 3 to 6 months, particularly if it's made from very good sort of fiber that's there. So it would actually push towards cheap products to more sustainable products as such, which could be reused over a longer period of time. But it needs to be treated in a way so that it's acceptable in terms of health and safety standards for the next person to take on. But yeah, there is a role for government to play, and they are playing a role.
I think that's very brave. I mean, that whole PPE issue is so global, so ugly, so complicated by virtue of the health and safety added component that comes with it. You know, I feel a bit depressed thinking about PPE because I think we can't even sort of have all of that, you know, health risk. So another massive problem.
Christina, can I just ask you about the sorting comment you made earlier? What sorting facilities do you have? What is your experience with sorting facilities in the APAC regions, and what could we learn from what you've experienced there? And then I just want you to comment on that. And then also, I'm very interested in the demand. How do we create demand? I mean, I think, yeah, I suppose from my perspective, as you know, with the work I do, that's really important to me. So it would just be interesting for you to comment on both of those.
Well, the reality is that most, if we're talking about post-consumer sorting, the reality is most of it is done by hand, by sight, by touch, which is very much, which is, shall I start it again?
No, I want you to actually just explain, we haven't actually done this yet, to explain the difference between pre-consumer and post-consumer waste.
Okay, so when thinking about sorting of materials, we have to make a very gross but very definite distinction between pre-consumer, meaning it's not being worn by a person, so it's clean and it's unused, and post-consumer meaning that it's been obviously used, etc. So if we're talking about sorting of post-consumer materials, most of it is happening by hand and by manual, by eyesight and touch, which is extremely laborious and completely cost ineffective, because you've got massive labor costs to sort a very low value material actually. So in Europe and US, you have definitely got much more sophisticated sorting infrastructure, which can use like laser lights and a technology to sort. But then again, you have huge expenditure costs to set up these facilities. So most developing countries are doing it by manual. And I'm sure 100% that that's true of South Africa as well, that it's manual sorting. So the challenges of that, of course, are cost, efficiency, speed, scalability to sort a soup of a mess of old clothes. So that comes with, you know, that actually is a huge obstruction to the value creation of waste. still it's still doable. And also I'd say one of the benefits of, you know, sorting is that the value, the actual financial value, is in reuse. I have sorted clothes. I've been bent over backwards, sweating, being eaten by mosquitoes, you know, like you name it. I've done it for years. And you can, I mean, I'm talking about Hong Kong, you know, clothing bins. I found Prada amongst Gucci, amongst Chanel. Of course, you've got a very well-heeled community in the bins that I've sorted in. But that is the real financial value, is on the resale. Yeah, I know you want to come to the bins in Hong Kong, and I've done them in London. Actually, London bins are really interesting because you get a lot of Asian, so there's a lot of sort of Asian saris, beautiful, but a lot more Indian clothes here in London in the bins. So my point is that it's manual, but the true value creation is on reuse of post-consumer rather than recycling. And then I wanted to comment on demand. I think that demand for recycled yarn, let's just say, is stimulated, and it's being stimulated enormously. The big global brands, they've got big sourcing guidelines, sourcing goals to increase recycled fiber output and sourcing. So that is for sure. You can pretty much go to any global brand, and I'm going to bet you 10 quid, 10 rand, whatever, that you'll find some kind of increased recycled yarn sourcing strategy. So that's all really good news. Where governments really come in is tax incentives on recycled yarns. I mean, looking at the China Central Policy, the China government issues like a 5-year plan every 5 years, looking at what their 5-year plan is, and they are consistently looking to increase export of recycled yarn. So that's a government-led statement of determination. And so I don't know the recycled yarn export of South Africa, but all I can say is that to push this, we need tax incentives on the export of recycled yarns. And then we will have a much better appetite on the cost side for recycled yarns. And I also just want to state something, which is that we shouldn't just think about the cost of recycled yarns without looking at the cost of virgin yarns. And all costs of raw materials are likely to increase in the future. You've got to balance what's the virgin price market doing at the moment. And if I have a crystal ball, and I'm not like an expert on the markets, but from my research and my gut feeling, we have a huge problem sourcing virgin materials, and that will make recycled materials more favorable.
Saliem, I just want to, very early on in our conversation, you were talking about WISP. If you can just describe a little bit more about what the opportunities are in the recycling of post-consumer and pre-consumer waste that you've seen that you've found in the Western Cape and South Africa.
Yeah, thanks. WISP is really the mechanism whereby one company's waste or one manufacturer's waste could be another one's treasure. So that one could actually cut off, and Esethu has already mentioned the sort of spiraling landfill costs that's there, and that's just the disposal fee, not even the transportation that's taken into account. So ideally, and we've started looking at within eco-industrial parks just to see whether there's actually close sort of knit synergies that could be generated whereby one company's sort of waste stream could be another one's sort of input material. So it's actually a lot of sort of listings that takes place where companies would reach out and indicate, and it would be for our sort of analysts to go out and just sort of ascertain what the sort of problematic waste streams are, what are ideally sent to landfill, and to try and match them up with companies that have a need for certain type of materials, of which textiles is of course one of them. Our focus predominantly is on pre-consumer waste because that's really where your bigger sort of gains are in terms of much less to treat, much less to handle in terms of taking through further processing. So that really is the sort of focus area that we're currently looking at. From the city side, they're also looking at post-consumer waste in terms of looking at areas where there could be sort of collection centers for these waste streams then to be moved to the next sort of step, where it can be further processed or recycled or reused, depending on just what the quality would be, what the demand would be, etc. for that. But in essence, that the pre-consumer is really the part that we are focused more on, and that we'd really like to see a sort of a bigger stimulus coming through in terms of any sort of unnecessary material that ends up going to landfill or not properly beneficiated that could otherwise do so.
So we're going to start closing up. I just want to, Christina, just before you go, when you're talking about the manual sorting, I mean, obviously, you know, my eyes light up and think, you know, that's job creation. But in terms of what you're talking about with efficiency, is it actually, are you saying that the sorting is not good enough for the recycling that needs to happen? Or are you saying it's just slow and laborious? I mean, for us,
yeah, it's all of the above. And I think the biggest challenge, if I could answer it to the core essence, is the mixed fiber. Because any good sorter could find a Primark versus a Prada, or a, you know, like a cheap bit of rubbish compared with a luxury leather good. You know, like most people who are sorting can pick out value, but people can't pick out fiber composition easily without turning the garment in and having a read. And that is very, 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 very slow. So for low grade materials, manual sorting doesn't work at all. Yeah. Because, you know, it's something that's cotton and a bit of polyester, you know, you can't really tell sometimes. You've really got to actually look at that on the actual label. So that is the real problem. It's your bulk of mixed fiber that people can't really pick up without reading. And that is crazy when you're looking at the amount of post-consumer volume that they need to sort.
And I've also read recently, I don't know if the Sourcing Journal did a webinar about textile waste, and somebody spoke about research that they had done around the labels, and often the labels are incorrect. So that's a problem as well. I mean, the labels do not actually don't reflect what's in the clothes. So
yeah, I'm sure there are mistakes. I mean, generally, you know, import regulations are quite strict on, you know, so you would hope that the industry is getting a bit smarter about putting the right fiber. Yeah. Does definitely happen, yeah.
I want to wrap up. Do you have something? I think we should just go around if there are any questions or comments you each want to make. And then I was asking if there were just, each of you can just comment on, just give a bit of little comment to a producer and to a consumer as a roundup. So Esethu, let's start with you.
Sure. I just wanted to make a brief comment on the work that WISP is doing and Green Cape is doing by basically creating these synergies between companies and clusters. And I think that's so important for especially our context in South Africa. We were finding, you know, in the Western Cape, there's a collector in the Western Cape, but there's a processor, you know, 8-hour drive away from the Western Cape. And for us to create this industry, the cluster approach, I think, is something that I've read in the literature that is working in other countries. So just creating those synergies in smaller clusters and in these business parks, etc., like you're saying, is so important to create the value chain, which will then in turn create the efficiency and the you know, of our textile recycling industry and process in South Africa. But just to wrap up, in terms of tips or advice for consumers and producers on my side, I think one on the consumer side, I think, is this idea of being conscious, you know, but what that actually means. I think that when we starting in the journey of purchasing a garment, usually that process of identifying the need and buying the actual garment is so much smaller these days. Like, there's no time to actually think, do I actually need this? And if I actually do need it, where can I get it from? Because when you come to the conversation about textile recycling, it really ends up to, we need to be creating less waste. That's it. We mustn't really be relying on the fact that we have textile recycling infrastructure, so we can still consume however we want to consume because we'll just recycle. No, we need to actually produce less waste to begin with. And so going back to a situation where identifying the need of if I need a garment or if I need this product, to actually purchasing it, extending that a little bit long will also help us to decrease the amount of waste that we'll be creating. Or even, because then what you do is that you realize that cool, I actually do need this garment, but do I need to buy it? Can I maybe borrow it from someone else? Can I maybe rent it from someone else? Or once it comes to the end of the life cycle of the garment, okay, I don't need it anymore, but I can actually give it to someone. So just taking time to increase the process from identifying the need to disposal, I think is very important, and just to constantly be conscious in that process and not to just rely on the fact that this takes our recycling. And then on the side of the manufacturers and the producers, I think that we've spoken a lot about materials, sustainable material sourcing, and as a textile recycler, like Christina's saying, the mixed fibers situation is really difficult to work with. We have clients, big manufacturers, where we're so excited. We're like, oh, 30 tons a month from one manufacturer, that's how much they're producing. But when we actually get to how much we can actually use from that, it's about 10 to 20% of the actual waste that we can use. So we can't do our work if at the production side there isn't sustainable material sourcing, because then it helps us at the end of the value chain.
Do you want to just tell the audience what fabrics you can recycle?
Yeah, so in South Africa especially, so if you are interested in disposing of your textile waste, what is able to be recycled in South Africa is 100% cotton, and obviously your natural fibers, as we've mentioned, all of the other natural fibers, denim, 100% polyester, denim, and 100% acrylic fiber currently that I know of. So we can put those up on the screen for you guys so that you can take a look, a screenshot, and you have those. But it's very, very important to not just, and I guess it goes back to that conscious thing, to not just rely on, oh, there's recycling, I can just dump my products. You need to make sure at the beginning that you are designing and producing for the end use. Yeah, that is my advice for consumers and producers. I have tons more to say, but I'll keep it there.
We'll talk to you again.
Yeah.
Thanks, Esethu. Salim, do you want to round off your comments?
I think, in the sort of, well, we're busy conducting research in this space at the moment, and hopefully in a few months' time, we'd be able to have some very good sort of results in terms of where Cape Town is actually going in terms of textile, let's call it sustainability, in terms of circular economy approaches. But things that we found is quality is one of the key things that affects the market. Sometimes those that's interested in natural fibers don't want it mixed with synthetic fibers and vice versa. So I think that separation is quite important. If it's mixed, as Christina had mentioned earlier, it's a problem. Color plays a big role because you've got to then put up chemical treatments within which to extract and get it back to where it needs to be. I'm a little bit worried about the actual solvent waste that comes out of it and how we could actually ensure, because that now becomes a hazardous product, how that should be treated further down the line. So it's not something that we need to lose sight of. Chemical treatment did push up the cost, so that's something we need to watch for. And thus far we found that oily rags is something that is very difficult to treat, and more often than not ends up within the landfill site. So there's definitely a big sort of issue with that. Then I've got a quiz for all of you. 2018, Mandela Day, Madiba Day, we did a quick cleanup campaign when I was still in my municipal sort of capacity. And we decided to offer people, volunteers, a token which they could exchange for one of the following items. And we had clothing, very good, high quality clothing that was sort of donated, seconds, of course. There were shoes, there was airtime, and that was from all 4 major networks, and these were all of equivalent value that we've put together. There were hamper packs that included the soaps, the candles, sort of basic household necessities, and then there were books. Which of those products do you think most people traded for when they got their token?
Data.
Airtime, for
Airtime.
sure.
All wrong.
What?
They
actually went for the hamper packs, and that's just to tell everybody, do not forget Maslow's needs. I think that it plays such a big role. Sorry, I may have omitted to mention that this was in a very, very low socioeconomic area. So, yeah, even we thought it would be airtime. That was the gut feel. It was not airtime. It was actually the basic household essentials that people wanted. So quite interesting.
Very interesting. Wow. Thanks for that, Saliem. Christina, over to you.
Well, I think to summarize and to give recommendations, I'm going to do it in the same statement, which is that there's one key shocking thing that we haven't said yet, which is the global economy loses 500 billion USD per year because of clothing underutilization and the lack of recycling. So of that 500 billion globally, there's some wins in South Africa, and that's very true. We've been exploring that. And I think I wanted to really say how powerful the circular economy is. All of our eyes lit up when we look at job creation. We care about each other. We care about the planet. I want to see people have prosperous jobs, and that's what we all want. And the circular economy can do that. There are billions of boundaries and hurdles and barriers and complexity. And my statement to you all is, isn't it great that we're trying?
Yeah.
And we're all very different on this conversation, and we all play a role in connecting, enabling, and powerfully trying to get it done. And so that's like my heart happiness to know that throughout this whole world, people are trying to get this circular economy going. And then I think really, what does that mean on an individual level? Well, we're involved in the fashion industry, so we've got to fight hard for it as professionals, but as consumers, we also have to fight hard for it. And so for me, it's that whatever we can do, whoever we are, we need to do what we can do and fight for it because it's worth it. That's my final statement.
It's great. I just want to thank you all so much. I found that completely fascinating and really, really interesting. And I love getting the different perspectives and the different levels of research and the different areas that you're all exploring. Thank you so much. Saliem and Christina for joining us from wherever you are. Christina from London, Saliem from, I don't know where you are. And thank you for coming in. And it was really lovely to meet you finally, Christina, and you, Saliem. And we'll be in touch.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye, Saliem. We'll be in touch.